He bought the 19-year-old virgin bride for $3, but she screamed when the mountain man kneeled. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the wooden structures of a small frontier town perched high in the hills. The town was quiet most of the time, with only the occasional passing traveler and the distant cries of animals to break the stillness. But today was different. Today, the air buzzed with anticipation as the townsfolk prepared for a yearly event that no one dared miss, the auction of brides. It wasn't something that happened often in these parts, but it was something that was always met with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Every year, the auction would bring together men from the surrounding mountains, plains, and valleys. They would come to bid on women who had reached the age of marriage, women whose families, usually facing hardship, would be forced to part with them for a price. It was the way things were done, old traditions in a town that clung to the past like the roots of the trees in the mountainside. Emma Walker stood among the other women, her heart racing in her chest as she looked at the small crowd gathering before her. She could feel the cold in her bones, not just from the crisp mountain air, but from something deeper, an unease that seemed to grow with every passing minute. She was only 19, yet today, her life was about to change forever. She had never imagined her future would unfold like this. Growing up, Emma had been taught that marriage was a sacred bond, something to be entered into with love and care. But now, standing before the crowd of strangers and rough-faced men, she couldn't help but feel that she was nothing more than a commodity, a prize to be claimed by the highest bidder. Her father, a man who had once been full of hope and strength, had changed in the past year. The farm had been hit hard by a brutal drought, and debts piled up faster than they could pay them off. When the money ran out, he made the hardest decision of his life, to auction off his daughter. Emma could hardly believe it. He had promised her a future built on love and respect, yet here she was, standing on the edge of that future where no such promise existed. Emma glanced nervously at the other girls standing beside her. Some seemed more resigned to their fate than others, but all of them carried the same weight of uncertainty in their eyes. There were no smiles today, no cheerful banter between friends. Instead, there was a quiet desperation that seemed to hang in the air like a fog. No one spoke. As the auctioneer's voice echoed across the town square, Emma couldn't help but shudder. The sound of it felt like a death knell to her hopes. His booming voice called out the names of the other women, each bid rising higher and higher. The men in the crowd leaned forward, eagerly waving their hands to signal their interest, their faces set in stone as if this was just another business transaction to them. And to some, perhaps it was. But for Emma, this was her future being decided in the hands of strangers. The bidding went on for what felt like hours, and Emma's nerves grew with each passing minute. She was next, she knew it. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. But who would choose her? What kind of man would bid on her? She could only pray that whoever it was would be kind, gentle, and not one of the rough men who had already claimed other girls with just a nod of their heads and a quick handshake. Then the auctioneer called out her name, his voice echoing like a hammer striking a bell. "Emma Walker," he announced, a slight gleam of amusement in his tone. A fine young woman, 19 years old, healthy, strong, and ready for a man's hand. Who will start the bidding? She felt the sting of betrayal in her own chest, but she also understood. The debts were too large, the farm too far gone. There was no choice. $3, came a voice from the back of the crowd. Emma's head shot up, her breath catching in her throat. She searched the faces of the crowd, trying to find the man who had placed such an impossibly small bid. No one laughed, but there was a murmur of surprise. The other men had been bidding far higher amounts for the other women. The highest bid for a girl this year had already reached $40, but this man, whoever he was, had bid a mere $3. Caleb Thompson, a man who had lived most of his life in the wilderness, stood at the back of the crowd with his hands shoved deep in his worn pockets. His rough, weathered face was set in a grim expression, his dark eyes scanning the other bidders. He had no interest in gold or silver. He didn't care for fancy clothes or luxurious things. All he wanted was something real, something he could hold on to. He had heard rumors of the auction and came, not expecting much but hoping for something. He didn't need a wife in the way others did. He didn't need someone to cook or clean or serve him. But Caleb, a man who had lived alone in the mountains for most of his life, had learned the hard way that solitude could crush a person. He wasn't looking for perfection. He was looking for something simple, someone who understood silence, someone who could endure the harsh winters and the long, lonely nights. When he saw Emma, his heart softened, though he would never admit it to anyone. She wasn't like the others. She had a quiet dignity about her, even in the face of such humiliation. She stood tall, even though her shoulders were tense with fear. Her face was pale, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that caught Caleb's attention. $3, he repeated firmly, raising his hand once again. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. $3, you say? He repeated, looking Caleb up and down. Are you sure? A fine girl like this. But there was something about him, something she couldn't quite place, that made her feel strangely safe, despite everything that was happening. The auctioneer hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. $3 it is then. Going once, going twice, sold to the man in the back. Her father's gaze never met hers as he handed her over to Caleb without a word. She felt a sense of helplessness wash over her, but there was something else, too, a strange sense of curiosity. Who was this man, and what kind of life would she lead with him? Caleb didn't say much as he guided her through the crowd and away from the square. His silence was both comforting and unsettling. As they walked, Emma couldn't help but steal glances at him. There was a sadness in his eyes, an emptiness that seemed to mirror her own. But his silence was not one of hostility. It was one of someone who had been alone for too long. And Emma. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The wind had picked up as Caleb and Emma made their way from the auction square to the edge of the town. The dust that swirled in the air clung to their clothes, and the cold seemed to bite into Emma's skin. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the worn ground beneath her feet. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of her future was pressing down on her with each passing moment. Caleb walked beside her, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the path. He didn't speak, he rarely did, but Emma could sense his presence beside her. He wasn't a man of many words, but there was something about him that was different from the others she had seen in town. He didn't look at her with the same kind of calculating interest that some of the other men had. There was no leering, no hunger in his eyes, just a quiet calm that, for some strange reason, both reassured and unsettled her. The silence between them stretched out, making Emma feel like the only sound in the world was the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. She wanted to say something, anything, to break the stillness, but she didn't know where to begin. She had no idea what kind of life awaited her now. Would he be kind? Would he be cruel? She didn't know this man at all, and yet he held her future in his hands. The walk to his cabin took longer than Emma had expected. They passed through dense woods, the tall trees casting long, dark shadows over the path. It felt like the world around her was closing in, and for a moment she wondered if she had made a mistake by accepting the situation instead of trying to run. But where would she have gone? The town was too far behind them, and the wilderness stretched out before her, unfamiliar and vast. She had no choice now. This man was her husband, for better or for worse. Eventually, they reached a small, secluded cabin nestled among the trees. It was simple, but it looked sturdy enough. There were no fine trinkets or decorations, no signs of wealth or extravagance. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. The smell of wood smoke wafted through the air, and the faint sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only sound she could hear. Caleb opened the door and stepped aside to let Emma enter. She hesitated at the threshold, her heart racing in her chest. It was as if the cabin, with its low beams and flickering firelight, symbolized the unknown future that awaited her. This was where she would live now. This was where she would be, perhaps for the rest of her life. The thought filled her with dread, but also with a strange, quiet curiosity. "Come in," Caleb said, his voice deep and calm. He didn't force her, but his words were a gentle command, as though he expected her to follow. Emma stepped inside, her boots making soft echoes on the wooden floor. The cabin was small, but cozy in its own way. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warm glow pushing back the chill of the evening air. There was a table in the center of the room, along with a few wooden chairs and a couple of worn rugs scattered across the floor. The walls were simple, with shelves that held jars of preserved food and tools for living off the land. Caleb shut the door behind them, and for a moment there was nothing but the crackling fire and the quiet hum of the wind outside. Emma stood near the hearth, unsure of what to do next. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her fingers twisted in nervousness. She couldn't stop thinking about the other women in the town, the ones who had been chosen by other men, the ones who had seemed so certain of their futures. She envied them, even though she knew their futures were no more certain than hers. "You can sit if you want," Caleb said, motioning toward one of the chairs by the fire. His voice was low, but there was an unexpected warmth in it, nothing like the coldness she had imagined in a man like him. Emma didn't know if she should sit. Should she wait for him to speak first? Should she ask questions, even though she wasn't sure how to frame them? She felt lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. But after a long moment she took a seat at the table, her movements tentative. The firelight flickered in her eyes, casting shadows on her face. Caleb watched her for a moment, then moved to the hearth. He placed a few more logs on the fire, his hands moving with practiced ease. Emma noticed the way he worked, quick, efficient, but never hurried. There was something methodical about him, as though every action was part of a routine he had perfected over the years. "Are you hungry?" Caleb asked, his gaze flickering toward her as he tended to the fire. "I've got some stew on the stove." She hadn't eaten much that day, and the thought of a warm meal was comforting, even if it was in the company of a stranger. She didn't feel ready to speak to him. Her mind was too full of thoughts and worries, but the gesture was a small kindness, one that made her feel a bit less like a prisoner and a little more like a person. Caleb served the stew into 2 bowls and set one in front of her. It was simple fare, root vegetables, beans, and a few bits of meat, but it smelled good, and that was enough for Emma. She took a spoonful, and the warmth of the food spread through her, offering some comfort, even if it didn't erase the anxiety gnawing at her insides. They ate in silence, the only sound the soft clinking of spoons against bowls and the occasional crackle of the fire. Emma couldn't bring herself to look at Caleb too often. There was too much she didn't understand about him. He was a man who had lived alone in the mountains, a man who had chosen a life of solitude. Why had he chosen her? What had he expected from their marriage? She wanted to ask him these questions, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she focused on her meal, her mind racing with confusion. Would things ever be the way she had imagined them? Would this man, who seemed so distant and unknowable, ever become someone she could trust? Finally, after a long, quiet meal, Caleb set his bowl aside and looked at her directly for the first time since they had arrived. His gaze was steady, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet understanding, maybe, or a hint of something else, that made Emma's heart race. "You don't have to worry," Caleb said quietly. "I won't hurt you." She had thought no, she had feared that he would be like the others, harsh and demanding, but his words, though simple, were sincere. "I didn't come here to take anything from you," Caleb continued. "I came because I need someone by my side, and maybe you do too." But all she saw was calm that seemed to settle over her like a warm blanket, offering her the first real sense of peace she had felt since the auction. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since her father had made the deal, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this man wouldn't be as cruel as she had feared. The days that followed Emma's arrival at Caleb's cabin were quiet, but they were also filled with a kind of tension. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from fear or anger. It was a quiet, unspoken anticipation, as if both of them were waiting for something to shift, for something to change between them. Caleb went about his work with his usual calm, tending to the animals, chopping wood, and repairing the cabin when it needed fixing. His routine was steady, almost unshakable, and Emma found herself watching him more than she wanted to admit. His movements were precise, and there was an ease in everything he did, as though he had lived this way for years without ever questioning it. For Emma, everything was new. The cabin was small, yet it had a strange kind of warmth to it, even though it was made of rough-hewn logs and smelled of smoke and earth. The fire was always burning, crackling in the hearth to keep the chill of the mountain at bay, but the warmth it provided wasn't just from the flames. There was a quiet comfort in the way Caleb carried himself, steady, unhurried, and not demanding anything from her. At first, Emma didn't know what to do with herself. She was used to the work on her father's farm, but here, in Caleb's cabin, she didn't know what role she was meant to play. Caleb didn't ask her to do anything specific. He didn't rush her into chores or assign her tasks right away. For the first time in her life, Emma didn't feel like her worth was tied to her usefulness. She wasn't sure whether that was a relief or another kind of weight. She had grown up being taught that women were meant to take care of things, to look after the home, to be active in the daily work. Here, Caleb didn't seem to expect that. But as the days passed, Emma began to feel the pull of the routine, the desire to contribute, to do something. It wasn't out of obligation, but because she wanted to be a part of it. One morning, after a quiet breakfast of oatmeal and bread, Emma found herself staring out the small cabin window at the line of trees that marked the edge of the forest. The air was crisp, and the ground was hard with frost. Caleb had already gone out to tend to the animals, and Emma, left alone for a brief moment, wondered if this was the right time to try something new. She had always been taught to cook, to clean, to be ready for whatever the day demanded of her. But here, with Caleb, there was no hurry, no urgency. His life, though simple and solitary, was measured by the seasons and the rhythms of the land. Emma had never spent much time in the wilderness. Her family had always been farmers, and the farm, while isolated, was not as remote as this. Emma stood up from the table, glancing one last time at the fire that burned low in the hearth. She made her way toward the door and pulled on her thick woolen coat. The fresh mountain air hit her lungs like a sudden jolt, and for a moment she hesitated. But the desire to do something, to make herself useful, pushed her forward. She wasn't sure what she would do, but as she stepped outside, she saw Caleb working with the horses. He was standing next to the corral, talking softly to one of the animals, his hand resting on its side. Emma watched for a moment, captivated by the way Caleb moved, the way he interacted with the creatures. There was a softness in his voice, a gentleness that contradicted his rough appearance. She walked over to him, the sound of her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. Caleb turned his head when he heard her approach, and his face broke into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it sent a strange warmth through her chest. "Morning," she said, her voice still shy. "Morning," Caleb replied, his gaze soft but direct. "How are you feeling?" They were calm, their breaths coming out in soft clouds of mist. Emma hesitated for a moment, then asked, "Is there anything I can do?" She had never been around horses much, but she had seen enough of them on her father's farm to know the basics. "I've never worked with horses much," she admitted, "but I'd like to try." "She's the easiest to handle." "You've got to let her come to you," he said softly, his voice calm and reassuring. "Don't try to force it." It was strange, but the moment she made contact with the horse, something inside her seemed to settle. There was something calming about the animal's steady presence, and she found herself relaxing, letting go of the tension she hadn't even realized she'd been holding. "Well done," Caleb said quietly, watching her with a soft expression. "You've got a good touch." Maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be as bad as she had feared. Caleb wasn't the monster she had imagined. He wasn't cruel or demanding, but instead he was patient, and he seemed to see something in her that others hadn't. The next few days followed the same rhythm. Caleb would wake early, and Emma would help him with whatever needed doing. She tended to the animals, chopped wood, and began to help prepare meals. Though the work was hard and the days long, it was somehow easier here in the quiet solitude of the mountains. Caleb never pushed her too hard, but he was always there, guiding her without speaking much. And in return, Emma found herself growing more confident, more capable. They began to fall into a routine, one that was both comfortable and unfamiliar. There was still so much about Caleb that Emma didn't understand, so many questions left unanswered. But with every passing day, she felt herself growing more at ease with him. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt natural. As the days turned into weeks, Emma found herself beginning to trust Caleb in ways she hadn't expected. And while she didn't yet fully understand the bond they were forming, she couldn't deny that something was changing between them. Something that, while unspoken, was as real as the mountains themselves. The days continued to pass slowly, each one blending into the next, as Emma settled into the rhythm of life at Caleb's cabin. The mountain life was harsh, yet it offered a kind of simplicity she had never known before. No longer did she have to worry about the heavy burden of expectations, the social pressure that had always hovered over her back in the town. Here there were no eyes watching her, no judgments to be passed. Caleb was kind, even if he spoke little, and that kindness had a quiet power. It made her feel, for the first time in a long while, like she was something more than an object or a burden. But despite the comfort she found in the routine, Emma couldn't ignore the shadow that lingered over them. Caleb had told her little about his past, about why he had chosen this life of isolation in the mountains or what had led him to the auction in the first place. At first, she hadn't thought much about it, but as the days turned into weeks, curiosity began to grow inside her. Caleb was a man of silence, and Emma could see that there were things he didn't want to talk about, things that haunted him. One evening, after dinner, as they sat together near the fire, Caleb fell into a long, thoughtful silence. Emma, who had come to recognize these moments when Caleb's mind seemed far away, couldn't help but wonder what was going on behind his eyes. She had noticed the way he often stood by the window at night, staring out into the dark woods, his posture stiff and unmoving, as if he were waiting for something, or someone, to return. She had asked him about it once, but he had merely shrugged and changed the subject. It was clear that he didn't want to talk about whatever it was that was troubling him, but Emma couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to his quiet demeanor than met the eye. She had a growing sense that his silence wasn't just from a preference for solitude. It was something deeper, something that clung to him like the mist that often rolled down from the mountains. One evening, as the fire crackled between them, Emma decided that it was time to ask him again. She couldn't go on wondering what haunted him, especially since she had begun to trust him in ways she hadn't trusted anyone before. The calmness that had once unsettled her now seemed like a quiet strength, and it was that strength that made her believe he would answer honestly if she asked the right question. "Caleb," she began, her voice soft but steady, "you never really talk about your past. About why you chose to live out here, away from everything." She needed to understand, she had to know. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice low and almost hesitant. "I didn't choose this life," he said, the words coming out as though they were hard to say. "At least not at first." "What do you mean?" "Not an easy life, but it was ours." "What happened?" she asked softly, not wanting to press too hard but unable to stop herself. She needed to know. Caleb's eyes wandered to the fire for a moment, his expression distant. "We lost everything," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of years of pain. "A fire. It started in the barn and we couldn't put it out in time, the smoke. It was too much. I lost them both. My wife, my son, gone in the blink of an eye. They were everywhere. Every corner of that place reminded me of them. I couldn't breathe there anymore, so I left. I came here to the mountains where I could be alone." She could only imagine how it felt to lose everything, your family, your home, your future, all in a single moment. Caleb had retreated into the mountains not just to escape, but to survive, to rebuild a life from the ashes of his past. She reached across the space between them, her hand tentative but full of an unspoken understanding. Caleb looked at her, and for a moment his gaze softened, the walls he had built around himself seeming to loosen just slightly. "I'm sorry," Emma said quietly, her heart aching for him. "I didn't know. I think it's part of who you are, and I'm glad you told me." But there was something different in the air now, a new understanding, a shift in their relationship. Caleb had shared something deep, something painful, and Emma felt closer to him than she had before. As the fire burned low, Emma leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with thoughts of what she had just learned. Caleb wasn't just the quiet, solitary man she had met when she first arrived. He was someone who had suffered, someone who had loved and lost, and who now carried that weight with him, quietly, silently, like a shadow. For the first time, Emma realized just how much he had given up, and she understood his need for solitude. But she also knew that deep down, Caleb was still searching for something, perhaps redemption, perhaps peace, or perhaps simply a place where he could belong again. And maybe, just maybe, she could be a part of that. The silence between them grew more comfortable after that night. Caleb didn't share much more about his past, but there was a new warmth in his actions. He began to talk to her more, not just about the chores or the daily routines, but about little things. The stories of his life before the fire, the books he used to read, the music he used to play on his guitar. It was clear that the more he shared, the more he was beginning to trust her. And with that trust, Emma felt herself growing stronger, more capable. She felt like she was not just living in Caleb's world, but beginning to create one of her own alongside him. There was still so much they didn't know about each other, but that night, something changed between them. Their bond had deepened, not because of grand gestures or dramatic promises, but because of the quiet understanding they had found in one another. And Emma knew with a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning of something new for both of them. In this section, we dive deeper into Caleb's past and explore the grief that shapes him. Emma, now more than just a reluctant bride, begins to understand the pain that Caleb has carried, and with that understanding, their connection deepens. This section focuses on the vulnerability between them, showing how they begin to open up and trust each other more. Landscape into a world of white. The cabin, which had been warm and cozy when Emma first arrived, now felt more like a fortress against the relentless winds that howled through the trees. Inside, the fire was always crackling, offering comfort and warmth, but even that couldn't fully chase away the feeling of isolation that seemed to linger in the air. Emma had learned to live with the quiet. There was a strange peace to it, a stillness that allowed her to think, to reflect, and to grow. In the beginning, the silence between her and Caleb had been unsettling. She had never spent much time alone before, and at first the absence of conversation had felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. But now she had come to understand it. Caleb wasn't a man of many words, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was a space where they could both simply be, no expectations, no need for constant chatter. It was a quiet kind of connection. It was the middle of December when Emma noticed the change. They had been living together for several months now, and although their routine had settled into a comfortable rhythm, something was different. Caleb was quieter than usual. He spent more time by the fire, staring into the flames, his expression distant. When Emma asked him what was wrong, he would shrug it off, saying he was just tired from the work. But Emma could tell that there was more to it. He wasn't the kind of man to hide his emotions, but he was also the kind of man who kept his pain locked away, buried deep inside, where no one could reach it. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside and the wind howled against the cabin, Caleb stood by the window, staring out into the night. Emma watched him from her chair by the fire, her knitting forgotten in her lap. She had learned that sometimes, when Caleb needed space, it was better to leave him be. But tonight, something felt different. She felt a pull to him, an urge to ask, to understand. Slowly, she stood up and walked over to him. He didn't turn when she approached, but she could see his shoulders tense as she got closer. "You've been quiet," Emma said, her voice gentle but firm. "What's going on, Caleb? You can talk to me, you know." He just stood there, staring out into the snow, his face half-lit by the glow of the fire behind him. Emma waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that getting Caleb to open up wasn't easy, but something inside her told her this was important. She had come to care for him in ways she hadn't expected, and she didn't want to let this silence grow between them, not when she could feel it pulling them further apart. After a long moment, Caleb sighed and turned to face her. His expression was tired, but there was something else in his eyes, something raw, something that made Emma's chest tighten. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice quiet but steady, "thinking about the future, about what comes next." She had been content in the simplicity of their daily life, and the thought of what might lie ahead had been something she pushed to the back of her mind. But now, with Caleb's words, that future was suddenly very real. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft, though her mind was racing with questions. Was he planning to leave? Was he growing tired of her? She could feel the panic rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Caleb stepped closer to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "I mean," he hesitated, and for a moment Emma could see the struggle in his eyes. "I'm not the man I used to be, and I don't want to drag you into something you don't deserve." She had thought that Caleb was growing more comfortable with her, that they had begun to understand each other. But now she felt like there was something else, something deep within him that was holding him back. "I don't deserve," Emma repeated, confusion and hurt creeping into her voice. "Caleb, what are you talking about?" "I've spent so much of my life alone," he said, his voice low. "I don't know how to be a husband. I don't know how to be the kind of man you need. You're young, Emma. You deserve someone who can give you more than what I can offer, someone who can give you a future, a family." There it was, the fear she had been sensing in Caleb, the worry that he wasn't enough, that his past would always be too much for him to overcome. But she didn't feel that way. She didn't need a perfect man. She didn't need someone who could give her all the answers. She needed Caleb, the man who had shown her kindness, who had protected her, who had shared his pain with her. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady but full of conviction. "I don't need a perfect man, Caleb. I don't need a perfect future. I need you. I chose this life with you. I'm not here because I have no other choice. I'm here because I want to be with you." Emma could see the uncertainty in his face, the way he struggled to believe that someone could love him despite his flaws, despite the past that still haunted him. "You don't have to be perfect," Emma continued, stepping closer to him. "You've already given me more than I ever expected. You've been kind to me, you've shown me patience, and you've shared things with me that no one else ever has. That's enough, that's more than enough." She had seen the man who had protected her, who had cared for her, even when it seemed like he had nothing left to give. Finally, Caleb spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can be what you need. You just need to believe that." The walls Caleb had built around himself had started to come down, not because he was ready to be perfect, but because he was ready to try. "I'll try," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll try for you." As the fire crackled in the hearth and the snow continued to fall outside, Caleb and Emma stood there together, no longer defined by their pasts but by the future they were willing to build. They didn't have all the answers, and they knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But they had each other, and that was all they needed. In this section, the emotional tension between Caleb and Emma reaches its peak, and the turning point comes when they both confront their fears about the future. Emma's unwavering belief in Caleb, combined with his willingness to open up and try, marks the moment when their bond is solidified. The chapter ends on a hopeful note, showing that while they don't have all the answers, they are ready to face whatever comes together.